Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sam, and today I wanted to talk about the books that I read over the past winter. You know, we're a little late to the game, but here we are. I'm going to break this out into genres. I have a licorice spice tea for hydration, and Bean is napping next to me. Kicking it off with Monstress, a fantasy comic by Marjori M. It was illustrated by Sana Takeda. The first volume in a larger series that I don't believe is actually finished yet. I read the ebook through Libby. I was reading this over the new year. I was trying to squeeze it in before the end of the year, but it actually was pretty lengthy and pretty dense, so it did take me a couple of days to finish it. Set in an alternate matriarchal 1900s Asia, in a richly imagined world of Art Deco inflected steampunk, Monstress tells the story of a teenage girl who is struggling to survive the trauma of war and who shares a mysterious psychic link with a monster of tremendous power. So there's a lot happening here, and it's very intense. The themes are literally like slavery, trauma, and war. So that being said, there is a lot of violence in this, but I think the art style is still very beautiful, very stunning. I didn't get to go too in depth onto the plot, so I would like to continue the series because I am curious to see where it's going. And then my next fantasy was The Hero of Ages, the third installment of the iconic Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. I read the ebook and audiobook together on this one. I think that was a really great experience also. I ended up doing that for a couple more books later on, especially these like denser, larger books. I find that I like the ebook audiobook combo. The premise here is we're following our main character Vin, who was a teenager living on the streets in the city of Luthadel, basically just getting by, but then turns out to have these special powers, gets recruited to be a part of a crew to run a heist. In the very first book, there's a lot of escalation and drama that culminates in this third installment. First of all, the themes kind of shift in this third book to center a lot on good versus evil. Pretty heavy theme around faith and religion, but not our religion, just religion in general. Also friendship, which I think is probably my favorite part of this whole book. I really love these characters and seeing them grow and seeing them grow with each other. I think this was also my first adult fantasy series that I read as an adult. I felt like I could really steep myself into this world, and I found a sense of really enjoying these longer books, which is not something I typically experience. I usually prefer much shorter and to the point, but I just liked spending time with these characters. You know, it was a little bittersweet to finish it, but I am really looking forward to continuing to read more in Sanderson's universe of the Cosmere. I did enjoy his writing and the way he really pulled everything together over the course of the third book here. I think that's a really cool reading experience when you get to see the full payoff at the end of a trilogy. My next fantasy was Babel, an Arcane History by R.F. Kuang. Another super hyped, well-renowned book here. This is more of a historical fantasy. Again, I read this like ebook audiobook combo. This follows our main character Robin from when he's a very young child and is rescued by an Oxford professor from his home in China, basically brought to England to be groomed to become a translator and further the power of the British Empire. The themes right here are pretty intense, all around colonialism, translation, language, academia, and privilege. I think this got a lot of hype because it is really well crafted. It's really important messages and themes, and it's done in a really unique way, bringing in this concept of translation as a magic system was really cool and very unique. That being said, this wasn't like a favorite for me. I think it was really good. I would generally recommend it, especially if you like historical or historical fantasy, but I didn't love the way the characters were written. I felt like they were really kept at a distance. You couldn't really connect with them as much. You really only get to see the negative parts of their lives. It just made the whole story feel less impactful when everything was doom and gloom. There was no contrast throughout the book. I felt less emotionally invested. And then after reading those two chunky fantasies, I got into the Dead Djinn universe by Djeli Clark. I think that's how you say it. I'm pretty sure that's how they said it on the audiobook. But this starts off with a novella called A Dead Djinn in Cairo. Then the second one is The Angel of Khan El-Kalili, another novella. And the third is The Haunting of Tram Car 015, the third novella. And then there's a full-length novel called A Master of Djinn, which I think is a little more popular, but I saw somebody recommend reading the novellas first, and I am so glad that I did. I've really enjoyed these short stories. There's such a high level of character development and world building in these that is really astounding for the number of pages that they are. So it starts off with A Dead Djinn in Cairo, which I think is my favorite of the three. They do all read as standalones. I will say I really would recommend A Dead Djinn in Cairo. Egypt 1912, in an alternate Cairo infused with the otherworldly, the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities investigates disturbances between the mortal and the possibly divine. The main character, Fatma, she is one of my favorite characters that I've read so far this year. I think she was just fantastic. I love this like kind of steampunky alternate history setting in Cairo. It's just so cool. There's a fun infusion of like mystery and also feminism. If you can't tell, I loved it. I was immediately hooked into this world and wanting to continue with the others. So I did go straight into the next one, The Angel of Khan El-Kalili. I read this one actually online on Tor.com. This one had a lot of the things I liked from the first one in terms of the world, this like steampunk setting. It's just a little more contained. It only takes place in this one room between basically a conversation between two characters. So just like a little less fun, especially in comparison to the first, which goes through all these different areas of the city. I did feel like it was still really solid storytelling and world building, even within that one scene, basically. Then you have the third one, which was The Haunting of Tram Car 015. It was a little longer. I didn't like the characters as much. I did enjoy the plot and the setting just as much as the first one. And you do get to see Fatma at the very end. She comes in and has a conversation with the main character at the end of The Haunting of Tram Car. I liked that little tie-in, and I'm hoping we get to see her in the full-length novel, The Master of Djinn. Yeah, having a lot of fun with this world and would recommend these novellas for sure. Then I read Fortuna Sworn, which is the first installment of the Fortuna Sworn series by KJ Sutton. I believe there's about 7 in the series so far. I don't know if it's done yet or not. This is a sort of urban fantasy romance. There's a lot of different mythological types of creatures. Mostly we are dealing with the Fae. There's a lot taking place in the Fae court, so you get to see this kind of like political intrigue happening. There is a very slow-ish romance happening, but also like a love triangle situation. So yeah, there's a lot of romance options. Aside from the court intrigue, you have themes around grief and trauma and morality. It was pretty fun. I will say there's a series of trials, which anytime there's trials, I'm usually a sucker for that. However, I did not love the main character very much. She was a little bit flippy-floppy, and as I mentioned, she has a lot of romantic options and seems to leave her options open. I just found her a little bit tedious. I will be continuing with the series for now, but I'm not totally hooked yet. Then I read The Atlas 6, part of the Atlas series by Olivie Blake. I again listened on audiobook, but it follows 6 characters who are brought into this secret society because they have exceptionally strong magic, and they're there to get the chance to research and further their powers and try to gain more knowledge and power. Ultimately, the themes here are very much academia and power. I thought that the characters really did a good job of playing off of each other and found their dynamic together really interesting. One of my main holdups here was I couldn't quite get into or believe in the motivations for the characters. This quest for knowledge and power, it makes sense for some people, but it didn't necessarily make sense for all of these characters. Also, I'll mention that the dialogue was oftentimes very grand and dramatic. The way that certain characters talk just sounds so ridiculous. In some sense, that was really fun, but sometimes it just got a little bit annoying. I will say there was a little bit of a twist at the end, which was pretty fun, and I was very much looking forward to getting into the second book to see where that would go. And then I finished Crooked Kingdom, which is the second of the Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo. This is a young adult fantasy. I read the physical copy for this one from my library. Basically, setup here is that it's a heist type plot with found family characters coming together. I absolutely love this recipe of, for one, a heist. Love that, and found family. Sign me up. I think this was so worth the hype. I think the plot is really fun and unexpected. You also have a lot of banter amongst the characters to keep things really entertaining throughout. I also thought it was really interesting how the main character here, Kaz, has no magic or powers or abilities, even though that's a big factor in this world, but yet it's not the main driver of our main characters here. So I thought that was pretty cool. You just get to see how he tries to use the resources that he has. There are some characters involved who do have magic, but it's not the main and only thing that matters, which is kind of cool. And then we're gonna get into our literary fiction. Start off with a bang here. We've got Lie With Me by Philippe Besson. This was translated from French by Molly Ringwald. Again, I listened to the audiobook from Libby. Basically coming of age queer romance. So all about first love and very emotional, a lot of heartache and angst, basically. I found it to be really captivating and just really sucked me in. I pretty much read most of this in one day. Definitely worth a good sit down, especially if you're looking for that type of emotional writing. I did love the writing style. I found it very impactful, for sure. My second literary fiction, which I've also seen classified as horror, but that was Bunny by Mona Awad. Another super hype, again for really good reason. Setup here is our main character is in a graduate program for writing. Pretty much feels like an outsider until she starts to befriend some of the girls in her class. Basically chaos and drama unfold from there. The themes here are around academia and art and I'd say mental health. I'll warn you that most of the characters are very unlikable, especially our main character, but I think that that kind of fits with the whole story and the whole vibe of the book. Everything else within it was really a 10 out of 10. I loved the prose, the character study, the setting, the plot. It was all just so brilliantly done. I was really entertained throughout the whole book and found the ending to be so interesting. Definitely an easy 5 stars for me, a new favorite for me as well. And then I read Weyward by Amelia Hart. I read this as an ebook through NetGalley. I think this could also be classified a little bit as magical realism or maybe women's fiction. Basically a character-driven story that follows 3 generations of women from different timelines across history, and all of them have this kind of common theme of feeling like they don't really belong with the people around them. They're not connecting with the people as much as they connect with like the natural world, like the animals and the plants around them. I read this at the very like kind of tail end of winter. It really got me looking forward to spring because there's just so much imagery of nature and it's in this beautiful countryside setting. So it's very cottagecore. I appreciated the author's use of language and descriptions and the way that she kind of made them fit each era so that it felt really cohesive for the time frame in which we were reading about. Because there are scenes from like, I think it's like the 1600s or the 1500s even for our oldest story, and then we have like early 1900s, and then we've got the like kind of present day, like 2017 is like the most recent. Yeah, I just think that she did a good job of making the imagery and the language really fit each timeline. I was kind of surprised by the level of graphic descriptions that were throughout the entirety of the book. So I'll mention some content warnings. I would say always check content warnings, but for this in particular, I noted that there was some on-page domestic violence, sexual assault, suicidal thoughts, a car accident, a death of a parent, and an abortion, all within this 300-something page book. You had a lot of beautiful imagery, like I mentioned, but you also had these really intense things happening on page as well, so just warning for that. And then my last literary fiction was a literary fiction slash short stories slash magical realism. It was called She and Her Cat by Shinkai Makoto and Naruki Nagakawa. This was translated from Japanese by Ginny Tapley Takamori. And I listened to the audiobook through Olivie. This basically follows 4 stories of 4 different women and their respective cats. You actually get the point of view of both the women and their cats, so it was very cute, and that's kind of where you get the magical realism aspect, is getting the animal perspective. I think the main theme here is essentially found family. Even though I didn't really love the characters in this, especially the humans, and also the side characters, I felt like were mostly just plot devices. But I did find it to be a pretty cute and wholesome display of how humans and pets can really enhance each other's lives and make them better and more full. So that was cute. Then we're diving into our nonfiction. The most important one here, my favorite, was Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. I shouldn't say my favorite, not my favorite, but like the one I would recommend the most. This was specifically written for women, but I do think that there's some tools in here that were pretty helpful for dealing with stress, and some thorough explanations of why and how we feel stress, and I think those can definitely be applied to any gender, but there were a lot of anecdotes and examples that were definitely all from a female perspective, and there is a lot of conversation around feminism and patriarchy specifically, so keep that in mind. So now my actual favorite is The Little Book of Hygge, Danish Secrets to Happy Living by Meik. Wiking. This was all about like comfort and connection. It was exactly what I needed in the dead of winter, and I finished my copy from the library and I immediately bought a copy for myself to lend out and revisit, as well as bought a copy for a friend of mine. So I think it's everything I ever wanted. It was like little drawings of candles and fireplaces and coffee, and it was literally just so comforting. Oh, and I was reading it on the train while listening to like soft jazz music, and 10 out of 10. Then I listened to Building a Second Brain by Tiago Forte. So this was all about productivity and organization and having a process that you can trust so that your brain doesn't feel bogged down by little notes and tasks to follow up on all the time. I did find it very motivating while I was listening to it. However, I actually didn't end up changing anything in my organization process. So take that as you will. I know there's also like YouTube videos and blog posts and articles that you can absolutely find and read and watch much quicker than actually sitting down and reading this entire book. So if you're interested in the concept, I would recommend maybe doing that. And then I read Ikigai, The Secret to a Long and Happy Life by Hector Garcia and Frances Morales. This was pitched as a book that would help you find your Ikigai and equip you to change your life. Big shoes to fill there, which they did not fill. The themes here were more health, longevity. This was definitely more about recommendations for a healthy lifestyle more than it was about finding purpose. Probably I just wouldn't have picked it up if that were the case. If I were interested in healthy lifestyle recommendations, I would have picked up a book by somebody who was a health expert. I would say my main takeaway from the book was basically don't do anything in extreme between working, eating, exercising, etc. Just moderation is key. So that was the main point, I think, of the whole book. Then I picked up the audio for Girl Wash Your Face by Rachel Hollis. This was like a nominee for Goodreads Choice Awards at some point, and I do not understand how or why. Basically, it's a memoir that's written in the style of like a how-to for success. Themes are mainly around like career and motivation, lifestyle. I think it's really great if you are looking for a pep talk, which is kind of the mood I was in when I picked it up. However, there's definitely not much in terms of like practical advice. I would probably give it a skip. After that, I listened to the audio for Present Over Perfect, Leaving Behind Frantic for a Simpler, More Soulful Way of Living by Shauna Niequist. Very similar themes, very similar to Girl Wash Your Face, in that it's all about career, motivation, and lifestyle. A slightly more softer approach, I think. It sounded like a little bit more mature, like there was definitely some good amount of reflection that went into this. I think that the author presented these things more as things that she was working through and not as just general like blanket advice. And there were definitely some things I felt like I could relate to, some of the sentiments that she was sharing. One thing that was really like off-putting and kind of like disconnected me from it a little bit was some of the anecdotes that she shared. It was just so clear that this author is just not lacking for money or finances in her life. All of the anecdotes basically just were so unrelatable that it did take away from my reading experience in general and how connected I felt with the book overall. Then I had read the physical copy from my library for Cozy, The Art of Arranging Yourself in the World. I was definitely looking for another Hygge style book, and this one was definitely more examples and anecdotes from the author's life in New York City with her family, but it did still have those themes of comfort and connection. On one hand, I really did like how the author demonstrated being able to find coziness in really any and every situation. But on the other hand, I did find that some things got really repetitive and just meandering. I was really invested in it for about the first half, but then I just kind of lost interest halfway through. There was definitely some potential, but I think it just needed some restructuring or editing, and it would have been a lot better. My next nonfiction was Getting Things Done, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity by David Allen. I listened to the audio again through Libby. This is basically like the OG productivity book that was published back in 2003. It still felt really relevant to the way that we operate and live our lives today. The themes here were very much productivity, motivation, and career. I think that of the kind of productivity books that I'd read here, I think that it had the most practical and effective tools. That being said, I was already pretty familiar with them because I've seen them talked about in a bunch of like the productivity YouTube videos that I watch. So I don't know that I really got much more out of it. If you're not familiar with it, it could be worth a skim if you're looking for ideas and ways to get organized. But there's definitely some good YouTube videos and articles on this on the internet, so I would recommend checking out the Getting Things Done principles by David Allen just in general. I think they are very useful, but I don't know that you necessarily need to read the full book. And our final nonfiction, The Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness by Deshawn Harrison. This is actually not a self-help at all. It's actually more about sociology. I listened to the audiobook through Libby. Themes here were around racism and anti-fatness and gender and identity and LGBTQ. So there's a lot of intersectionality in this discussion. On the one hand, I did think that this explored some really important and interesting ideas that I don't necessarily see discussed too often. It did provide some historical context, which was helpful. It also had some interviews with some Black, fat, trans individuals. Those were pretty interesting. But overall, I found that it read a little bit like a textbook. I found that it was kind of difficult for me to necessarily understand and retain some of the information that was being shared, some of the ideas that were being expressed. I think some of it did go a little bit over my head. But if this is kind of a field that you are interested in and sort of familiar with, I would recommend it. I did have a really interesting chapter on beauty standards. There's definitely some interesting ideas being explored here. But yeah, I had a little bit trouble of retaining some of it. I may need to revisit this topic in another book, basically. That is everything that I read over the winter. I think out of all of those, I would say my favorites were definitely Crooked Kingdom, The Little Book of Hygge, and Bunny. Some real amazing, happy, enjoyable reading in that season for me. And if you've read any of these, please leave me a comment if you had any thoughts on these books and if you maybe agree or disagree. I would love to chat about it. Otherwise, if you did make it this far, please leave me a bunny emoji in the comments. I am so thankful for you for sitting and watching this, and I will see you in the next video.